There was going to be an adage for why certain development projects hit a wall. Take it from this former local reporter, it's the parking, stupid. We can't really escape the fact that we're a car-based society, traffic is a bane on all of our lives, and we don't all necessarily have the public transit that runs when, where, or how we need it to. So, if we must have cars, it follows there must be a place to park them. Some cities and towns think actually we've been going about it a little bit backward. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. Today, I'm joined by Somerville City Council President Ben Ewen-Campen, and we're talking about parking minimums. Stay with me, I promise this ties into how we travel, build, and adapt to the state's promised greener transportation environment. So, Councilor, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So we are talking on Friday, the 13th of December. So what did the Somerville City Council do last night?
Last night, the City Council got rid of mandatory parking minimums across Somerville. Back in 2019, Somerville passed a new citywide zoning that had already eliminated parking minimums within a half mile of a new train station, and that covers something like 70% of the city. What we did last night is to finish the job, to have it cover the entire city of Somerville.
So what was that purpose there? The idea, obviously, I think could be tethered a little bit more cleanly for people when you're thinking about proximity to transit, but why extend it to that additional 30%?
I think it's worth just starting by saying talking about parking policies is really hard. It is simultaneously incredibly counterintuitive, and some might say boring. And it is also infuriating to people because every one of us has been in the situation where you're coming home or you're trying to get somewhere on time and you cannot find a parking space and you see red and you are just in a state of unbridled fury. I have certainly been there many times, and we all know it's gotten way, way, way worse over the last couple years. And I just think it's worth kind of emphasizing that this is a topic that people viscerally feel strongly about, and I am one of them. Let's just start the conversation there. In my experience, trying to fix this problem is incredibly counterintuitive. People think there's not enough parking in Somerville. We need to build more parking. That is a completely reasonable thing to think. Decades and decades and decades of people have thought that and have done that. And the unfortunate reality is that that very intuitive strategy has just been proven to be counter-effective over and over and over. Everywhere that we do it, it has had the opposite effect. It's actually made traffic and congestion worse. It has not solved the problem, and it has ultimately brought more and more and more cars into cities.
So it does seem what you've gestured at is something that came up plenty during my time as a local reporter in Dorchester, which is this sort of chicken and egg problem that can be very difficult to get your head around, which is requiring parking good because people drive and therefore need to find somewhere to park, or is having that parking encouraging people to drive knowing that there might be somewhere for them to park. So as this sort of project of figuring out Somerville's parking situation has unfolded, how have you found yourself thinking about the relationship between those two premises?
Let me tell you a story about a constituent. I know someone in Somerville, lives in a single family house, didn't need her driveway anymore, wanted to put a shed on it, I think for her kids to play in, wanted to get rid of her driveway, and was not allowed to. She was legally required to have a parking space. That is what a parking minimum policy actually is. It says, even if you don't need this parking, you have to have it. So that's a very small example, right? One person, one house. On the other hand, we have some pretty large commercial developments that are being proposed or built now in Somerville, large lab office buildings. Oftentimes, those folks will come to a community meeting for their proposal, and they'll say, so in order to meet our minimum parking requirements, we need to build 500 new parking spaces, 600 new parking spaces, whatever it is. And the crowd rightfully goes crazy and gets the pitchforks because we can't possibly afford to bring in 500 new parking spaces for every new office building. So the way that I think about this is we should not be dictating with arbitrary rules how much parking is absolutely required in every new development. We should let the people who actually understand how much parking they're going to need, whether that is the homeowner or whether that is someone who's building a new lab building, we should let them figure out how much parking they actually need and build it. I think it's really important for people to understand getting rid of parking minimums does not mean you can't build new parking. Developers absolutely can build new parking, and they absolutely will build new parking, and they will build the amount of parking that they actually need for their projects. What this means is that the city of Somerville is not setting arbitrary minimums that we're going to require.
Somerville is now, after this extension to the final area, essentially, of the city, is now the second municipality after Cambridge to completely abolish the idea of parking minimums here. Boston and other municipalities have changed or altered the requirements for parking minimums for, say, very large buildings or affordable housing units or something within a certain distance of transit. But I'm curious, thinking back to how this is actually unfolded in Somerville, what were you watching? Were you looking at what other cities and towns were doing, or were you charting something that felt very tailored? How did that actually unfold?
I'd say that the process has been quite long to get us to this point. So the citywide zoning overhaul that Somerville passed in 2019, that's where we got rid of parking minimums close to train stations. That was the result of something like 7 years of work. And at that time, I remember kind of quizzing the staff as we were going through these years of deliberations. These parking minimums that we're talking about, where did these numbers come from? And to their credit, the parking staff said, they're made up. They're made up. I don't want to speak for our city staff, but there is no empirical data suggesting that we should have parking minimums. I have not met anyone who works in the field of urban planning, transportation planning in Somerville, in Cambridge and Boston, who thinks we should have mandatory parking minimums. My sense of this field is that there's not a huge professional debate amongst people who study and work in this field. What there is a very real, visceral feeling amongst the public that parking is a nightmare, which is true, and hoping that if we require parking, it will make it better. And kind of all of us, I think, just coming to terms through our own experience that requiring parking, it doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't solve the problem. And you can just look at study after study after study. I look a lot at this study by the MAPC, the Massachusetts Area Planning Council, where they just looked at off-street parking structures in residential developments in the greater Boston area. And they look at the times when they're maximally occupied. So, the middle of the night when everybody's home parked. And something like 30-40% of the spaces are empty consistently in every community. That does not mean every building. Obviously, some of the parking lots are full, some are more empty, but the average is very, very consistent. Too much parking has been built because of these parking minimums. It's not to say no parking is needed. Of course it is. Tons and tons and tons and tons of people need to drive. We know that. They need a place to park. I am someone who, I personally mostly bike around, but I have 2 young kids. I drive more than I wish. I have to, right? And parking's a nightmare. It is.
When you're thinking about where parking is needed, because one of the things that comes up in this discussion is, the city is not setting a minimum parking requirement, but as you've noted, of course, people are driving, so people still presumably need to park somewhere. What has the strategy been for thinking about, well, maybe there are some areas of the city where we should make sure that there is available parking? That's one of the questions about city planning here, saying, well, does that mean you think about where there might be a well-suited large area for a parking structure? Or again, is the fear that if you say the easier you make it to drive through the middle of a downtown area, the more likely it is that that kind of traffic pattern self-perpetuates? So this idea of, do you just kind of hand it over to the individual building projects and say, you tell us how much parking you need? Or is there still some sort of role to play for the city in figuring out, well, where would we like to see a substantial amount of parking happen if there must be a substantial amount of parking happening?
So Davis Square in Somerville, there are a few small, publicly run parking lots where, you pay to park in the lot, and the city maintains those because we believe it's helpful to the local business community there. These are not giant structures. We don't want to bring in thousands of cars at rush hour to Davis Square. But the reality is, it supports the local business community. It makes it possible for people to visit Davis Square who otherwise might not be able to. There's also a red line station there. So it's, the reality is the city has determined it's helpful to have those parking lots there. And I think lots of residents would agree. I think you could also have a good faith argument. Is there something better to do with that land? Maybe there is ultimately, but that works there. On the other hand, for larger developments in Somerville, we have what are called mobility management plans that are negotiated between our city's mobility department and large property owners. And these are very technical agreements around how the transportation challenges of a really large building in an urban environment are going to be met. And one of the things that goes into these mobility management plans, and this is in everyone in Somerville, is if there's going to be a large underground parking garage under, say, a lab, an office building, or a large residential building, those parking spots need to be available to anyone who's willing to pay market rate. Those spots cannot be bundled together with a specific apartment or a specific job. If someone in that building wants one of those spots, they need to pay market rate for that parking. If a business wants to have these spots available to their employees as an incentive, they need to pay market rate. This sounds very complicated, but basically one of the huge issues that this area has had is if you look at the early development, for example, of Kendall Square, huge parking lots were built. And as a perk to employees, basically, it was, we have a place for you to park for cheap. That's a great policy if you happen to be that worker who gets a great spot to park. And I'm sure that it was helpful for these businesses. And as you repeat that process thousands and thousands and thousands of times, you create the traffic nightmare that we have in the greater Boston area, where there's just been this huge incentive to live elsewhere and drive into work every day, as opposed to, my day job. I work at the Harvard Med School in the Longwood area. There just is no place to park. There just isn't. There's a years-long waiting list to get a spot in the garage. It's really expensive if you ever do get it. And so I have to bike or take the bus. And when I took that job, I knew that. And there are certainly days I wish I could drive, but I can't. That's the nature of the job. I think that's just kind of the reality for these, is we can't possibly have a parking spot for every single person who wants to drive to their job. It's very, very simple math. Look at how many lights are on in a huge building and think about how many cars that would be. There has to be a balance of how you get people there through public transit, walking, biking, some amount of them driving.
There's a few kind of interwoven threads when it comes to the driving problem or the traffic problem in Massachusetts, and one of them is literally the traffic problem. We are back to pre-pandemic levels of traffic in the greater Boston area. That was a much faster bounce back than people riding public transit. But then on the other side, you also have the kind of environmental considerations of, do we want people driving? Do we want people driving some types of cars and not other types of cars? So what we've talked about so far has mostly been focused on kind of the brutal experience of just having a lot of cars on the road, as someone who is also trying to get along those roads. So does this seem to mostly be a traffic equation, or how is kind of the climate side of it factoring in or not?
I think the climate issues and also housing affordability are very important as we consider parking minimums. I think I'm not going to sit here in good faith and say, oh, we're going to tackle the housing affordability issue and solve the climate crisis by getting rid of parking minimums. But we have to do everything that is within our power as a municipality. And this is a really important step that we can take. The unfortunate reality is that traffic and parking are just some of the hardest problems there are to solve. If they were easy to solve, some city would have solved them a long time ago, and we haven't. I mean, the way to solve it is to have incredible mass transit. I think we're all on the same page that if you want to make it possible for people to not drive as much, there needs to be really, really good mass transit. And I love the mass transit in Massachusetts, huge supporter of the MBTA, But we all know it's hard, right? It's really, really hard to rely on that, and it doesn't serve, every route that you might need. It's not satisfying as a politician to tell my constituents this is a really hard problem. And the reason it's hard is not because a bunch of idiots who don't care are in charge. In fact, really smart public servants who really care about this and really feel for the people who are, experiencing all of these issues are trying really hard. And it is actually a very, very difficult problem. And we are kind of turning every knob that we can. These are kind of long-term, huge forces that you're up against, and you need to chip away as much as you can.
So, what have you seen in the areas that have eliminated the parking minimum requirement? And I'm also thinking, obviously, Camberville is also often considered very much in conversation with every other part of Camberville. So, looking at what Cambridge has seen, thinking about what you've seen in the 70% of the area that has eliminated the parking minimums, what's it look like?
It's working. It is very clear that we used to require an excess of parking. And now that we no longer require the excess of parking, the amount of parking that is actually being built is significantly less. And that's how it's supposed to be, basically. So that means there are some projects that are getting built, apartment buildings that have no parking. And in Somerville, we have a policy actually that takes it a step further and says within that 70% of the city that was covered, if you do not build off-street parking, the residents of that building also, you can't get on-street parking passes from the city. That has been kind of an experimental policy over the last 5 years, and it has not stopped construction of new buildings. Lots and lots of people need a car when they're moving into a place, but lots of other people don't. And so what this has meant is that some number of the new buildings being constructed have no parking, can't get on-street parking passes. So the people who live in those buildings, they either don't have a car or they rent a spot somewhere privately. No one thinks that that is going to be a solution that works for everybody, but it's certainly a solution that works for some people. Some people don't need a car. They should be able to get an apartment too. It is possible to do projects like that, and it's also possible to do projects that do have a little bit of parking. And we're seeing a mix of that.
So one of the critiques of sort of at this period in time, given sort of our transit woes, etc., we need not delve all the way into that in Massachusetts right now, but the critique is that at some level is getting rid of parking minimums, sort of getting out ahead of your skis, sort of the idea that people do sort of fundamentally need cars and transit isn't quite there where they would want it to be, so that there might be a more positive outcome in the areas of the city that do have better access to public transit, and then it gets harder in the areas that don't. So how have you thought about the timing of pushing for this? Is it to guide driver behavior? Is it responsive to what we're seeing right now? How much of it is wishful about perhaps having better transit infrastructure in the future?
If a developer wants to build a building somewhere in Somerville and they think that they don't need to build parking, that they'll be able to find people who can live there without needing on-site parking, and if they can convince a bank or a lender that that's financially feasible, I think they probably know their market a lot better than I do. And if they think they need to build parking to sell those units or open that business, they'll build parking. I actually find that the banks and the folks who finance new developments, they tend to be relatively conservative and very worried that, oh, you better build some parking. And so I think we're going to absolutely continue to see new parking being built for new developments. I just think that the amount of parking is going to be kind of right sized to what is actually needed for the people who wind up using those buildings, again, as opposed to people like me picking a number out of thin air and saying, I obviously there has certainly been concern and pushback on this from residents. And I've always tried to ask, okay, how much parking should we require? What's the right number? And that's not a gotcha question. That's a real question. The city, if we're going to have a parking minimum, we have to pick a number. If you ask an expert what that number should be, I've never met a urban planning expert who will tell you any number except there shouldn't be a minimum. We should not be setting it. Any number I tell you is arbitrary. I will also say, when we first started talking about this, probably one of the first calls I got from the press was a reporter who said, hey, I wanted to talk about getting rid of parking. Can we maybe meet at one of the locations where you're going to be getting rid of parking? And I had to stop the reporter and say, what? We're not getting
Right.
rid of parking. This is about future developments. There's a whole other conversation around things like pedestrian safety, pedestrian safety improvements, bike lanes, where there is reduction on street parking. And that's a completely legitimate public policy debate to be having. It's just totally separate from the issue of legally requiring new developments to build some amount of parking, regardless of what they actually need.
Yeah, I feel like it's no mystery to anyone who's watched the past few years, especially with, say, outdoor dining very much being connected to fights over on-street parking and the question of do streets sort of inherently belong to cars unless proven otherwise and that sort of thing. I wonder, because you mentioned, of course, needing to talk to constituents about this and this being a very long process. Have you learned anything about a sort of effective way to talk to people about parking, which is often a pretty unexpectedly emotional issue for people? They think they can sort of just say, well, let's talk about the math of it. And then they end up, at least in my experience as a local reporter, 2 minutes later having very strong feelings about a very specific intersection that they need to drive through constantly. So it becomes much more emotional than it might seem for an urban planning problem.
It's a legitimately very emotional issue. No, I don't think that there's a slam dunk way to communicate about this with people who are skeptical or frustrated. I mean, let me be clear, there's a ton of very visceral support for this. This idea, as we started working on it, was actually being pushed by local environmental organizations, local transit organizations, a lot of local like parents of young kids organizations that are thinking about the future and how to move safely around the city. There's a ton of support for this. Part of the way to talk about it, and I think this is true of any issue in local politics, is to just be genuine and respectful. This sounds like politicians speak, but I really care about my constituents. I know them all personally, not all of them, but Somerville is not a huge city. It's neighborhoods. We know each other. We see each other on the street. You really don't want to be dismissive of people's concerns. I try to be as straightforward and transparent, as honest as I can with folks, and also try to separate out these different issues. One of the really, really tough things to talk about when it comes to parking is that in Somerville, something like 90% of the parking in the city is long-term resident parking. In Somerville, you can get a parking pass for $40 for the year. So that's whatever that is, $3-4 a month, less than $1 a day, maybe, to park anywhere in the city. And every residence, there's no limit on how many you can get for a house. So if there's, say there's a triple decker and 4 or 5 people live in each unit, that's 15 permits, $14. From a public policy standpoint, that is probably not a wise policy. We're basically subsidizing quasi-infinite cheap parking on the street everywhere. We need a lot more. We need short-term parking for small businesses. We need places for Meals on Wheels to park. We need places for delivery vans to park. We need places for loading for businesses. We have a lot of different needs. It is a very, very difficult conversation, I think, for a politician to come in and say, what we should do to solve this problem is raise the price of your parking permits. If you never had to face voters again, that might be the right policy to do. But it's hard for politicians to do stuff like that. I personally think that we very much should have a conversation like that, about the more permits that you have for certain residents, maybe there's a progressively more expensive to have some kind of disincentive for just infinite on-street parking permits for less than $1 a day. I think that would both solve the problem and probably be extremely unpopular as it first started to pass.
It was floated for a hot second in Boston and then never talked about again. That tends to be the way, and we merely have neighborhood parking permits here, and that still comes up. I think the last thing that I'm curious about while I have you here is, to the extent that you've thought about it, how widespread do you expect this policy to be? We talk a lot as though kind of cities and towns are little silos, but I think the MBTA Communities Act and intentions by the state to sort of approach regional planning a little bit differently does indicate that these are all kind of getting layered on top of each other. So it might not be somewhere specifically very distant out in like Western Massachusetts, but are you in conversations with other nearby municipalities in Greater Boston saying we're going to see how this goes for you, or we're working on this?
I would not be surprised at all if a lot of other communities start taking a go at this. I mean, even if you just look at like the leadership of the MAPC, the Massachusetts Area Planning Council, they've been studying this issue in communities across Greater Boston for years. This is an organization, they're an honest broker. They're trying to advise communities on like what is the right policy to balance the need to build new housing, to bring in new businesses without kind of drowning your city in traffic. I hate to be pedantic, but it is the right policy. You can't talk to someone in this field who studies it, who tells you otherwise. I think it can be a difficult conversation to start, but I really do think that there's a lot of value in pursuing it. And, we haven't talked about it here, but building parking is incredibly expensive. And it means that is space that cannot be used for new housing, for a new business, that can't be used for green space. There are real trade-offs to building a ton of parking, especially parking you don't need. So it can just open up new types of proposals for what can fit on a lot if you're allowed to have flexibility about what parking is there. So I think it's kind of a win-win-win. It's a win for the climate, it's a win for safe streets, and it's a win for like opening up the possibilities for new kinds of developments, honestly, without much of a downside. And I really do believe that, the folks who are making these developments, they're going to build the parking they need. They won't be able to get the financing for it if they don't. And then in terms of dealing with any impacts that has on local, like on street parking issues, communities have tools like we did in Somerville. I'm not saying that everyone should follow our lead on no more on-street parking passes, but there are tools that I think communities have at their disposal to look at what are the effects on local on-street parking issues nearby.
Thanks again to Somerville City Council President Ben Ewen-Campen for joining me on the Codcast. Thank you for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our producer is Claire Wigglesworth. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other people find us, and email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We'll be back next week.